Hey, everybody. Welcome back to The Collective. We have another outstanding show coming up here very quickly. First off, thanks, everybody, for being here. This is awesome. And second of all, any thoughts, any questions? Anybody got anything off the top of their heads that they're like, hey, man, we should talk about this? Anybody?
Just good to see y'all.
No? All right, cool. Then let's jump right into it. So I was telling Seb and Kate before Shaun and Glen, you guys got here, is that we have one of our audience members has DM'd me some questions in the background for us to talk about. And not only that, I figured out how to use the system some more. So we have
system upgrade.
Boom. Here we go. So this is the first question. Yeah. I'm listening to Extreme Ownership and know that Shaun in particular takes value in what Jocko says and stands for. So my question for the podcast, the collective, for whatever, is growing up, who was your Jocko that you listened to and took inspiration from that you believe shaped the person you are now? Who wants to go first?
I'll go first since my name is being called out.
All right, Shaun, you're up, man.
Just to set the record straight, I suppose, or I just want to clarify that overview, and it's this. Yeah, I like Jocko, and I like what he stands for, but that doesn't mean that I mindlessly follow him. I listen to what he says, and I determine what works for me and what doesn't work for me, or what can work for others, and etc. So I don't just mindlessly consume Jocko and believe it to be 100% correct. He's way more correct than most, but he's not always correct for me all the time. So having said that, who was my Jocko? There was no internet when I was coming up to be inspired. And so what did I take my inspiration from? I'm going to call out a guy. The first Jocko that I ever bumped into was a friend of Seb's. Seb knows him well, and it's Ken Murphy. And I bumped into Ken when I first got posted to Commando, and I think I've mentioned this maybe once in a live chat, that I saw Ken, I target locked on him, and I thought, that's the guy who I'm going to start emulating. So he became my Jocko. And, I'm sure that Ken won't be too comfortable in me giving him all this praise, but he was the man. You just had to look around. You knew who the man was, and Ken was the man. And I wanted to chase that Jocko for a while. So Ken was my Jocko for a bit.
Okay. That's a good one. Anybody else? Kate, who was your Jocko? Other than Jocko.
Yeah, Jocko's a big one too. And I, of course, have heard about, the legend of Ken Murphy for sure recently over the years. But yeah, I mean, growing up, like I didn't have podcasts or anything like that to listen to. And I think it probably would have helped maybe instill a little more discipline in younger Kate. But when I went on BMQ, there was a sergeant there, Sergeant Chris Thompson. He was with the Queen's Own Rifles in Toronto. So he was a airborne guy, and he was pretty like hardcore, but he always reinforced that sort of like quiet professionalism. And he wasn't just, like there were some Navy people there that probably thought they were a little more hardcore than they actually were. And they'd just be screaming at people all the time. But this guy, like, he was quiet, and you could tell that he meant what he said. And, if he raised his voice, there was a good reason for it. So he was always kind of someone that sort of helped, I guess, maybe shape my future for the military. And I'm still kind of in touch with him on Facebook and things like that. So it's kind of neat to see what he's up to now.
That's pretty cool. Glen, let's go to you. Who's your Jocko?
I'm going to have to go with Terry Fox.
Ooh.
Because I grew up, again, before the webcasts and all that stuff happening. So I saw what he did and the sacrifice that he made and the physical limitations that he didn't let limit him. And I just always thought that was amazing. And then the fact that his name, I mean, to this day is it just, it brings out emotion in everyone when they talk about him. So I'd have to say Terry Fox.
That's a good one. Seb, how about yourself?
Yeah, there was quite a few influential people in my life, and I think I would be disingenuous if I selected one over most of them. So, to clarify, Ken Murphy is a stud, no questions. So he's obviously one of those guys that I was exposed to quite early during my military career, even before I joined the force, and then we worked together when I joined the force, which was great. Bruce Lee was one of them as well. Bruce, if you've never sat down to listen to Bruce Lee speak, a lot of the stuff that came from the man was stuff that's being I don't want to say regurgitated today, but stuff that's being said today as if they were said for the first time. But yet there was a man that was probably 50 years, if not 60 years ahead of his time in areas of his personality, and I was able to connect with a lot of stuff that Bruce Lee proliferated. And then when I joined the force, there was a leader by the name of Rob Tan, and Rob Tan was the absolute epitome of professionalism. He's still active. He's a Toronto team leader, but his actions, his words, his everything he did was absolutely on point as a leader, and he was a true example of what a truly charismatic and competent leader was like. And I was fortunate enough for him to be my team leader for a bunch of years. And I can say without a shred of a doubt that I modeled my leadership style very much after Rob, with my own twist. Just to reiterate what Sean Taylor, mentioned, it's okay to take some and leave some. It's not going to work for all of us. That's exactly what I did with that. But yeah, Rob Tan was probably one of the biggest inspiration in my life.
Those are all awesome. Like the thing that I really love about this question is that depending on the area or the time frame that you're looking at your own life, it could be different people, and they could lead you in different ways and different manners, and you could be picking up on different pieces of their story or their what they did, what they view, where they've been, those kind of things. You can pick up on those later in life and then look back on it and go, oh, yeah, okay, I get that more. One of the biggest ones for me is my granddad. Both my granddads. One was an engineer in World War II, and the other one was a rancher his whole life. Spent his whole and I remember watching him in his 70s. I would have been a young buck at that point in time, tossing hay bales over his shoulder all day. Just okay, this has got to be done. And that, a lot of my work ethic I learned from watching him. Just stuff's got to get done. Okay, let's get it done. No emotional reaction to it. Not like, oh no, one of the fences went down, the cows got out. It was just like, okay, let's go get the horses. And that was just it. It was smooth, calm. He's seen it. He's done it. Okay, let's work it out, and then see what solves the problem. And it was, but yeah, those two guys, my granddads, those were the guys I really looked up to the most throughout my life. Now we have a second portion.
Well, hang on a sec.
Okay, you got a point?
Well, it's not a point. It's just an observation.
Okay.
As I sat here listening to everyone, it's something that I hadn't considered myself. So for anyone who's listening out there, my initial thought was, who was the first person who inspired me in 3-dimension? So an organic human being that I could poke and think, oh, it's called Ken Murphy. But to everyone's point, everyone was inspired in different ways through a different lens. So, I'm going to use Seb as an example. He mentioned Bruce Lee. Man, I love on Bruce Lee. Everyone knows that. And for sure, I should have said Bruce Lee instead of saying Ken Murphy, or should I? Because there is no instead.
No.
Yep.
So I just wasn't thinking laterally enough to consider, oh, Terry Fox. Well, of course, Terry Fox.
Mm-hmm.
But I'd simply gone immediately to who was the guy that I stood next to for the first time and thought, oh, this real person is the real deal. But Bruce Lee was the real deal. And so my point would be that there's many people who have influenced me. There's many people who've influenced all of us I think what is important is that we consider real people, historical people, people in books, and etc.
That is a great point. That is an excellent point on that, because really, again, it really depends on who you're, at what point, and in what manner you're talking about inspiration. Was it a physical inspiration? Was it a societal inspiration? Was it a et cetera, et cetera, et cetera? Spiritual, could be anything, right? And it's interesting too to see the first thoughts across the board of like who they came up with right in the like, okay, we're talking about either work or spirituality or et cetera, et cetera. It's a very interesting question. He carries on. There's a second portion to this question that I think you're all going to really enjoy. Here's the follow-up. Who is someone that has completely opposite views on things you're passionate about, but you value their opinion? And why? That's a tougher question now, isn't it? Any thoughts from the peanut gallery? Who wants to start?
Go
Seb,
on, Seb. You're over there groaning and moaning.
I'm going to throw you on the fire, yeah.
Sorry, guys. I guess I've exteriorized my inner thoughts.
Thank you for doing it for me as well.
you know, it's really interesting. I totally accept and favor having somebody that has dissented views so that we can have the constructive conversations and do all this good stuff. But at the end of the day, if I have somebody with completely opposite views of what is it or what it is that I stand for, I don't know that we're going to have that much in common. It's more that people will have difference of opinions in certain things. So we're going to have a lot in common, for example, and then on one certain thing we absolutely are opposite or polar opposite, and then that person might stick around. But if there's actually nothing in common, I'm not even entertaining that. I don't know what the point of that is, aside from if I want to listen to somebody to hear them articulate their dissenting point, I will definitely do that, but I don't think that they will be a part of my daily operations, so to speak.
Yeah, that's a great point, because it's tough to figure that out. Shaun, you got a point?
I do, and it's a follow-on to what Seb just said, because how Seb just described it is how I feel, with the waiver being this, that I mean, Seb has completely opposite views on things that I do from time to time, very rarely, but he has. And I don't want to talk about, he thinks this about this person and I think that about another person. I don't want to use names, but Seb and I could kind of have a quiet chat and a laugh on the side if I started bringing up names. And he has way different views than I do on that person. And that, what I guess to the question, but you value their opinion and why? I value Seb's opinion as an example because he's Seb. But why am I interested in listening to his opinion? Because I know that he's not dogmatic. So he can have completely opposite views on things than I do, but because he's not dogmatic, because he's open-minded, because he's intellectually curious, because he loves not sticking in one point forever, he moves. And so through a conversation, I can enter into a conversation with Seb full well knowing that he has a completely opposite view about it. And I'm not going to enter into that conversation to try and change his mind. I'm going to enter into the conversation to see how our minds change. And they always do. He's always been able to influence my opinion on things to some degree. And I hope that I've been able to do that with him to some degree. But I will entertain conversations with Seb for the rest of my life, irrespective of his opposite views or not, because I know he is an open-minded, lateral thinker that pursues betterment rather than dogmatism. I was trying to make up a word there, but being dogmatic.
You were flowing 100% there.
Yeah,
right?
sorry. And then I got to a weird word that I couldn't make
You had
up.
to make something up. How about Kate? You got any thoughts on this one?
No, well, I mean, my first thoughts are that this person has really good questions that make you make you think.
This
So,
is Winterstorm 427. You throwing down awesome questions. Every
yeah,
time.
really good. So, I mean, kind of along the same lines, like the people whose opinions that I value the most are probably people who generally have the same views as I do. Like maybe there'll be a few little things here and there that vary, but for the most part, like at the core of what my values are and their values are, they're probably pretty similar. But I mean, I do think it's important, I guess, to listen to other people's views who are different than yours. Like even sometimes, I'll go on YouTube and I will listen to views of people who are potentially like controversial or who people might think like, I don't know, think ill of these people or whatever, right? But I'll go and listen to them just to hear what they have to say and like, oh, okay, well, why are they so controversial? Why, let's hear their arguments about why they don't agree with X, Y, and Z, right? So I think it's definitely important. It doesn't mean that I have to agree with them, but I think it's important to kind of listen to all sides.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. Glenn, you got any thoughts on this?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to my mind is earlier Glen, like younger Glen, because I've changed so much and since my early 20s, since I guess adulthood, that my view on things have 180, and and so I still respect the earlier version of myself, but I definitely don't agree with all of his opinions, right? So and I guess that's all part of growth.
Yeah.
And if I did have the exact same opinion as earlier me, then I didn't change. And so I'd have to say someone that's a complete opposite view, 20-year-old Glen. And and that's not a bad thing.
No, that's actually a pretty good thing. You stole my answer. I was also going to say 20-year-old Glen, but what can you do?
That's awesome. Screw Glen.
Right? Especially 20-year-old Glen.
20-year-old Glen sucks.
But the real key thing there is that it's about growth of yourself, because if 20 years ago and you're still thinking the exact same way you did 20 years ago, have you grown? Have you developed your opinion? Have you listened to people that you didn't agree with at that point in time and then slowly evolved and changed and created? And I don't mean drastically different, because 20-year-old Chance is not drastic. Well, okay, maybe pretty drastically different than who I am now today. But that's a great point, is if you can look back on yourself and go, oh, okay, I didn't agree. I don't agree now with what I did then, but hey, I've learned something. And now I can reapply that knowledge forward to better yourself or others around you, and so on and so forth. Anybody got any final thoughts on those two questions, or do you want to move right into the
only thing that was worse than the 20-year-old Glen was the 20-year-old Shaun?
Oh, I didn't know the 20-year-old Shaun, and I was probably
I barely knew him either.
I was pretty small when that happened, so I'm kind of glad I didn't know 20-year-old Shaun at that point in time. So let's get right into the overall topic today that we were going to talk about. And I'm going to preface this a little bit because Shaun and I were having a conversation in the green room, which is where we get most of our gold from and most of the topics we come up with. I can't remember what I was saying, but I was saying that I was doing something, and then I heard Shaun's voice in my head say, just do your best. Just out of the blue. And I was like, oh, right. Okay. I'll just do my best. So the question is, when things are going south, when the stuff is not happening the way you want it to, and you're starting to lose it, whose voice do you hear in your head? Who's the guy on your shoulder that's whispering in your ear going, or gal on your shoulder, I should say. Who is it that's talking in your ear saying, let's tighten this up a little bit? I'm going to throw Kate on the fire. You're up first.
That's funny, because I was just thinking, so yesterday, I just got back from a work trip, like jet lagged, so tired. And I was laying on the couch, and I actually had Seb's voice in my head from his video when he was like, people talk about how they need to get back on track. Like, stop getting off the tracks, stay on the tracks. so at that point yesterday, it was Seb's voice, but I guess it's kind of, I mean, it depends on what I'm doing. If I'm doing like a long run or something, maybe it's David Goggins or someone else. And sometimes it's just my own head, because sometimes I'm my own worst critic. So
Okay. Seb, what do you think? Whose voice is in Seb's head? When you're in Kate's head, who's in your head?
I'm living there rent free. For me, it's really myself. I have a propensity to have the little voices, the negative voices, and humans in general have that. But I can be quite aggressive with them, and they can start creeping real quick on me. So I mastered the art of using my own voice to shut them down. Because if I didn't, I don't think I would have what it takes to handle them, just on account of who's told me what that I need to be remembering at a certain time. I need to be able to shut them down as soon as they pop up, as soon as they start making themselves, or I become aware that I'm doing a certain thing, whether it's, I'm being a victim, I'm creeping into victim mentality, or I'm about to go out and I'm making excuses, or I'm procrastinating, whatever the case may be. It needs to be addressed right now. And I just jump all over that. This is one of the things that basically logically and overwrite him immediately. And so, yes, over time, there might be some things, like if I'm dealing with a situation at work or something, I may hear good, right? Because I think everybody to a certain extent relates to good. But generally speaking, it's generally my own voice telling me to smarten up and do so in not always in the most eloquent way. It's just like smarten up.
Nice. Glen, who do we hear in Glen's voice? Is it 20-year-old Glen, or is it like 30-year-old Glen?
Oh God, it better not be. He's still at the bar, so I guess
I just bought you another round, by the way.
Yeah, that's not good. I'd have to say it's probably my dad. And I know we've mentioned before, like about heroes and everything. My dad's a great guy, and I get to work with him. I have a law enforcement training and testing company in Richmond, BC, and I work with him every day. And he's in my head. I when I got hit with a rocket in Afghanistan and I had to get out of my vehicle, it was on fire, I was thinking about him. When I was making decisions in Ukraine, I was thinking about him. He was one of the driving forces to go to Ukraine, to make sure that we all want to make our parents proud, but he was also the driving force in coming home, because I left him with the company to look after. So I'd have to say it's my dad, who's he's my hero. So it's a good voice to have in your head.
Yeah, I would say so. And we got to get him on the collective.
Yeah.
So I'm putting that on your shoulders, just to add another little bit of flame to the fire here.
Absolutely.
We'll get him on here. We can have a chat with him. Shaun, what do you think? Who do you hear?
Immediately after seeing the question, my immediate thought was me, my own voice. That's who I hear. And for all of the same reasons that Seb relayed, that's kind of how my head works. That's how I work. But then when I had that initial thought of, oh, it's my own voice, obviously, I then took a second to think, well, why is that? Because I'd never really thought about that before. And so my initial thought was, that's because I've been a Ronin for a long time. And it's because when I was in the military, I had lots of good influences around me, and I could hear their voices while I was hearing my voice. But then when I left the military, I was a Ronin, baby. And so there's no one like standing next to me saying, hey, do this or don't do that. There's only me. And yeah, sometimes I was surrounded by people in the various careers who I was either command and controlling, or they were command and controlling me as a Ronin, but there was just me. Because a lot of those people, I don't want to say they were temporary in the various careers, but they were in and out of my life. I'm owning a coffee shop, you're in my life, and now I don't have a coffee shop, you're out of my life, and I'm on to my next career. And so I've met a ton of great people, but none of them are still with me per se. because I'm still kind of living a Ronin lifestyle. So I got to rely on me. But as a tertiary or as a secondary consideration on this, I thought, well, who would it be if I had to pick someone that I hear in my head? And my next thought was this: well, it depends on if I need a negative or a positive push. And so I thought, what would it be negative? And it would take me back to basic training, where there was this evil little man. And I mean, he was just straight up mean spirited. There was nothing good about him. He was just mean. And he was a sergeant, and he was my section commander, and he put the boots to me. I remember running along the range road out in Camp Wainwright in the blistering summer heat. Just him and I. He was in a pair of jungle boots. I had my full fighting order weapon and rucksack, just running down next to him. He was barking at me, trying to break me and blah, 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 whatever. And he was just all kinds of mean, and not mean in a good way, just straight up mean. And so I can still see that guy in my head as a negative impactor, but as a positive reinforcer. And so anytime I need a bit of a negative push, it's like, yeah, you know what? Screw you, pal. I'm going to show you a thing or two. Like, I'm a grown-ass man. And I still think that guy's all rent-free in my head because he sucked. He was the epitome of freaking loser, except he was a sergeant. And I thought he was like the man, but he was the complete opposite. I just didn't know it at the time. So now as a grown-ass man, I can look back at that clown and think, I'll never be like that. So it's kind of a negative push. I could name positive pushes, but those were my initial thoughts.
That's awesome. The funny thing is that, yeah, I hear my voice and I hear your guys' voice in my head pretty regularly. I mean, I think everyone here lives rent free in my head. There's lots of room in there though, so it's okay. Like you guys got your own separate rooms. It's all good. As I was thinking about the question when we were talking about it after the green room there's one thing that has always been in my head, and it's been there for a long time, and it was my high school social studies teacher, who I can't remember his name. I can picture his face, can't remember his name. And he told me one thing. He was a reservist, an infantry reservist, went to Cyprus, did some cool stuff, and he was a high school social studies teacher. And I was struggling with a paper at one point in time, and he looked at me, and I think this is the one piece of advice that will stick with me throughout my whole life. And he asked me a very simple question: what is the actual problem? And then I was like, at the time I didn't really understand it, but as I've gotten older and older in life, and it's just sat in my head. Anytime I sit there and I struggle, or I'm like, I don't know what is, like, I got to get through that. And I hear it in my head, what is the actual problem? And then I go, and it gives me a second to detach and actually look at what the problem actually is. And then I can overcome it. And I think it's interesting too, because as Shaun put it, when things are going south, you're going to hear a certain voice. But when things are all going well, there's a whole other voice. It's a different part of you, different access point in your memory banks. Do you guys have a different one for when things are going well that, checks the ego or something? Kate?
Yeah, well, I just kind of wanted to add on to, I guess, what I was saying before, where sometimes I hear my own voice in my head. So I used to be, and I still am, but I've kind of dialed it down. But I used to be so hard on myself and just have this negative talk all the time in my own head. And I think to a certain extent that can become very detrimental, right? And I've sort of dialed that down to the point now where it's like, okay, if I'm doing something difficult, like say I don't know, sign up for a run that's way too long that I'm having trouble with, and I want to stop, and I'm thinking in my head like, oh yeah, this hip pain isn't so good, and like, maybe I should have prepared better for this. I should probably stop. It's like, well, no, I know my body can handle it. So put that voice aside, and like David Goggins says, reach into the cookie jar and think, okay, I did this, and this before. Like, I can handle this run. And just sort of being aware of when your brain is trying to talk you out of doing something, and put that aside and just get in that mode where you have to do something. But then at the same time, don't be too hard on yourself in certain situations to the point that it's detrimental, if that makes sense.
Yeah, makes perfect sense. That you described my whole tagline of grace, not slack.
Mm-hmm.
That's the whole point, is like, you got to look at yourself objectively and go, okay, I've done the work. I'm good to go. And when all those negative voices come in and they start trying to beat you down, you're like, but I did the work. It's okay. Okay.
Yeah,
I don't,
and with everything for Up Pegasus coming up, that was in my head every time because I'm terrified of heights. So every time I'd go up in the plane, like I did it the first time, and then it's like, okay, I guess I'll go again. And then I would have that argument with myself every time. I'd be like, okay, I did it once. I landed safely on the ground. Like, why am I taking this risk again? I should just call it a day. And then I'd be like, oh no, but it's kind of fun. Like I should go again. And then I'd be up in the plane. And as we're climbing to altitude, I'd start going over all those things in my head and doing that again. And I just did it so many times that now it's kind of like, oh, I'm looking forward to going. But before it was at that point where in the back of my head, I'm like, oh, if they cancel this because of the weather, I wouldn't be too upset.
I had a very similar conversation on my second jump. I was going up there. I'm like, why am I doing this? Like,
Yeah.
I've already did it the one time. I was perfectly fine. Got no issues. Good. Why am I doing this again? But then you're standing outside on the wing and you're like, well, I guess it's happening anyway.
Well, I guess I'm not dabbling anymore.
yeah. And then you get to the ground and you're like, that's awesome. I want to go again.
Exactly. Once you're floating up there and you're staring at the mountains and the ocean and it's an unbelievable time. So I mean, if anybody hasn't yet, go sign up for Up Pegasus Jump. Like seriously, geez, if you haven't done it yet, you should go throw yourself out of a plane. It's a great time. But Glen or Seb, is the voice different for you guys when you're on a roll? Do you need to like check yourself, or do you guys have that same voice in your head that's like keep pushing? Who wants to take it?
Go ahead, Glenn.
So I have a big fear of failure, and that I use that as a motivating factor. So I did Mountain Man, and I was right out of my BIQ, the battle school there. And
good old Mountain Man.
I didn't do any training. I didn't have time because I had just finished, and on graduation they said, who wants to do Mountain Man? And they told us what 30-something kilometer run with a rucksack on, and no one put up their hand. And then they said, you can go to Edmonton for a week. Well, I was 2nd Battalion. So I was in beautiful, balmy Shiloh, Manitoba. So I'm like, yeah, I'll do it. I can run. I'll do it.
Yeah.
The whole time I ran, all I was thinking of is an injury I could fake. I'm thinking, it's got to be good. It's got to be a bone sticking out. There's got to be blood. But I use that, like, next thing I know, I'm done the 35-kilometer run, and I'm getting it, like, I'm loading up a couple of sandbags or hopping into a canoe, and I'm going, I'm almost done. And then I finished in the top 10, and I was like, okay, I did it. But the motivating voice in my head was negative. And it was just all I could think about what was a suitable injury to fake. Or not, I guess not really fake if a bone sticking out, but it was all negative. But I use that as inspiration to keep going.
That's awesome. Looking for those gopher holes, right? It's like, where can I throw my foot into this and just and see what happens? Seb, what do you think? What do you got?
Yeah, that's funny, Glenn. I did Mountain Man for the first time as a Leo in 2007, and it was a blast. I trained somewhat, not crazy, but it was quite the reality check. That canoe ride, 10 kilometers upstream on the Saskatchewan River, is a long time.
Yeah,
especially after you just ran like over a half a marathon, right?
Mm-hmm.
And your legs are spaghetti. I did it. Yeah. I believe I did it in 2007 also. So we'll have to.
Did you?
I believe I did. I think that was the year. It was right before my tour.
Well, it's right after the crew got hit over in right. So I can't remember what the date was exactly, but you remember that friendly fire incident killed a bunch of the PPCLI folks.
Yeah. Yes.
Yeah. So it was either the year after or I can't remember exactly when the day was, and I apologize for that. But yeah. Aside from that, what was the question again?
The question is, the voices in your head. We were talking about like when things are going south.
Oh,
and you talking. You hear that yourself in your head. But what about when things are going well?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have like a little checks and balances in the background there, or do you just give her?
Yeah, you know what? I have a really interesting thing going though with my head, and I think that's courtesy of having been disappointed on absolutely everything I've ever taken on when I was younger. And it's just by way of circumstances. I'm not trying to make it sound like my life was horrible or anything like that, but there was a ton of adversity growing up. And one of the things that kept on coming up for me was always being disappointed. I never saw something that made me happy get to the end of it, aside from surviving. so I think what happened is it used to sting a lot until it stopped completely. And so when things are going well, I anticipate that things are gonna either change or switch. But when it does happen, I don't care. Like, I continue going forward, right? Like, it's when I say I don't care, I don't mean I actually don't care, but I mean it doesn't change what I put in, right?
Mm-hmm.
I already anticipated I was going to fail. I already anticipated I was going to face additional adversity, or that things were going to start going sideways. What is my next move? What is my next move? I don't spend any time like dwelling over potentially what could come up or whatever. If it's going well, I will take it. It's there. It's kind of the wolf you feed. You have it there in the corner, and it's kind of looking at you, and I acknowledge its presence and give him a little bit of food, because you don't want an animal starving looking at you, because you know what happens.
Mm-hmm.
It just comes out 10 times stronger. But also, I don't really I don't have a nihilistic approach on, everything's going well, I'm probably going to die or something.
It's all happening too well.
Or something bad has to happen because I'm doing so well. It's like, no, I will get disappointed. That's a fact at some point, but I'm in.
Yeah. Keep
moving forward.
That's the tough part when you when everything's going really well and you start looking around like it's too quiet, right?
Yeah, I think it's a byproduct of there's professionally induced cynicism in there. There's some nihilism. There's a variety of different things, right? Like, we've seen so much stuff, and so it's easy to go down that route. But it's also not very constructive at all.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah. Shaun, any you want to round us out? The voices in your head when things are going well?
Yeah, this one's super easy because it's the same dude called Shaun. So when things are tough, I hear my own voice. And when things are good, I hear my own voice. And by good, I mean, like, let's say I just won Mountain Man. Mm-hmm. And here's what I hear in my head. Check. That's the extent of my conversation with myself when something has gone really well. Because I'm not going to dwell on it. It's of no value to me to just keep on pumping up my air and keep on telling myself how well I did at Mountain Man. And this is me in my head. If I won, check. Yep. What's next? And that what's next is not like, what's the next thing I'm going to win? My head says, what's the next problem in front of me? And that's what I target lock on. And so we'll call it the good Shaun, the congratulatory Shaun who says good things. His vocabulary is pretty limited. but in respect to Shaun that keeps me on the straight and narrow with the, you know what, you best dial that up a little bit, pal. That guy has got a whole bunch more vocabulary. Mm-hmm. And so we'll call it bad cop and good cop. Mm-hmm. The good cop Shaun, he's not got a whole lot to say. Bad cop Shaun, he keeps me in check. And so I hear my own voice. It's not like I hear anyone else's voice. I just hear my own voice because there ain't much of a conversation required. It's typically this check.
Yeah. That sums up basically everything I know about you. So if everybody wants to know Shaun, that's Shaun right there. But so it actually leads directly into the next comment I had on this, or the next thought pattern was, Shaun, you and I and Julie were talking about the tributes in Rome. Do you guys know about how that all worked, and when a conquering general would come back to Rome and he'd get the whole, ride through the city, and you see the scene in Gladiator. Well, the tradition of that is that there's a slave sitting in the chariot with you, whispering in your ear, memento mori, remember you are mortal, right? The whole point of that is to check, you've done something great, but remember that you're still a human. So the question I had for Shaun and Julie, when I was talking to them, was when you reach what you want, when you attain all the things that you're searching for, then what? Then what goes through your head? What is the next thought when you go, ha ha, I've climbed the mountain? Then what happens? Glen, you're going on the fire. Boom. It's up to you.
That's tough. I've never been really good at it. Every time I get to a end goal, I just pick another goal, and I just pick. I was always a long distance runner, and I would pick someone else that was running, and I'd be like, I'm going to catch that person. And once I caught that person, I didn't just stop and start walking. I would pick another person and be like, I got to catch that person. And Mountain Man was different because I was just picturing which bone I was going to break, but. But this was it's my whole life I feel like we all write a book, and as soon as you're done a chapter, you just start the next chapter. There's not like a big pause. It's not a bunch of empty pages, and I just keep going, and it's probably why I burn out. I'm not sure if anyone else has been in that same boat, but I've not woken up one day or I ran myself to the ground so hard that I didn't sleep, and I just waited for something. I remember in Ukraine I was talking to Shaun, and Shaun's like, well, what's your exit strategy? I had no idea. I didn't even think about it until Shaun put that in my head. I just kept going and going. So my end goal, like what happens when I hit an end goal, I don't know. I just keep running until the wheels fall off and don't get oil changes, right, Shaun?
That's true.
Seb, thoughts on this?
Yeah, I'll echo a bit what Glen has said. I'm kind of the same way, but for me, generally, it's the 2 or 3 pitches before the end. So whatever that peak is, 2 or 3 pitches before, I've already set my sight on something else, which may include going to the top. But what is the follow up? What is the follow up to that? And how can I make this one endeavor sort of impact positively as many aspects of my life as I humanly possible? And so I'll and it is sometimes most of the time it's just an introspection. I will be launching in an introspection. When I was wanting to make it to a team, I already knew I wanted to be a team leader eventually. I already knew I wanted to have my own team. I already knew. So there were several summit, so to speak, right along the journey, and they were already pre-established. So it's not like I was getting ambushed, like, oh, I'm here now what, right? Like they're and really, and this might sound a little bit tacky or even something that should be on the back of a cheap t-shirt you wouldn't buy, but I'm here. What does that even mean? Like, there's no destination and there's no reaching the destination. What are we actually talking about here? Like I want to get somewhere, but then the journey continues. So what is your plan once you get there?
That's a good question.
Yeah.
Kate, what do you think?
Yeah, I'm kind of the same way. I mean, I just feel like I always need to be working towards something, or working towards some kind of goal. So it's like, if I want to do maybe a specific course in the military and I do that, then okay, well, what's next? What's the next thing to be working towards after that? Because otherwise I feel like I'm just a bit like stagnant, or I'm sort of floating around with no purpose. And then if it's something athletic, like I'm not a good, runner, or I'm not gifted like physically or anything like that. So for something like maybe a run, like I did the Finlayson Arm 28K last year, which is a pretty brutal trail race, and I was not racing by any means. I was pretty slow at it. But then this year I'm like, okay, I'm going to sign up again and see if I can beat my time. So to answer your question about like, what happens when you climb to the top of the mountain? Well, then, find a higher mountain or climb that same mountain faster. There's always a next level to that.
Yeah, that's 100% correct. Shaun, you got any thoughts on this one?
Well, when you asked the question, here's what I thought. I visualized climbing a mountain. And so let's call that mountain a career. And I've had 7. I'm in my 7th career now. And so every mountain that I've climbed, when I got to the top of the mountain, we'll call it, here's what I did, I believe, is I stood on top of it. I took a deep breath. I looked all around me. I identified another mountain. And I thought, I think I'll head over there. And as I identify that next peak, I don't know how to do it. I don't know what it's going to take. But as I'm walking down off the mountain, I take a bit of time to think, I wonder how I would do that. And by the time I've got to the bottom of that mountain, I know how I'm going to start my first step up the next mountain. So I think it's important to understand that, when you're climbing to whatever your top is, when you get to the top, take a moment, take a big breath of fresh air in and appreciate what you just climbed. And while you're up there appreciating it, take a moment to look around and enjoy the view and maybe see what interests you. And once you see what interests you, as you're walking down the mountain, which, by the way, is sometimes as hard as going up the mountain, while you're walking down the mountain, appreciate what you've accomplished as you head towards your next goal. Now, here's the thing I really want to put across is not the analogies or metaphorism of mountain climbing and seeing peaks, and now you know which direction you're going. I want to say this, that we're all talking about mountains, because guess what? I look at this crew, and we've all climbed a few. Now, what about the person what if it's a 16-year-old guy or girl out there who's never climbed a mountain? What if their idea of a mountain is a tiny little molehill on their front lawn called 10-foot tall mountain? Now they take 2 steps up and they're standing on their mountain. They're looking around. Guess what their view is? Nothing. Because they're not high enough. They haven't established a tall enough hill for themselves. Their idea of a mountain is a molehill. What I'm suggesting is this. Reframe what a mountain means to you. If your idea of what a mountain is a molehill, challenge yourself to kajabillion that. So now it's a Mount Everest. And I mean, that's going to be scary. You may think that you'll never accomplish it. Guess what? There are so many humans that have climbed Mount Everest that quote unquote shouldn't have been able to, and yet they did. Mm-hmm. And so that's the case for all of us. Challenge yourself to accept more of yourself. Pick a higher mountain, and the higher the mountain that you pick, the better the view, the bigger the challenges in front of you once you start looking truly out to the horizon.
That's a great point. Kate, you had a thought?
Yeah, so my thought, again, talking about mountains and how we were talking about beforehand, sort of like who's your Jocko. So before podcasts and any of that, I am hugely into reading about mountaineering. And one of I guess sort of the big Jockos for me was Ed Viesturs, and he's just a wicked American mountaineer, like one of the first American to climb all of the 14 peaks over 8,000 meters without supplemental oxygen, just insanely impressive. And so in one of his books, his quote is, "Getting to the top is optional, getting down is mandatory." Mm-hmm. So a lot of mountaineers have obviously lost their lives, and people on Everest get so focused on getting to the top and reaching the summit that they exhaust all of their oxygen. They go past their cutoff times because they're just so focused on getting to the top. And then they forget about that part about having to come back down, right? And which sort of goes back to what Glen was saying about burning himself out. So has to be very calculated. You have to get to that top, but then still have some energy left and some gas left in the tank to safely come back down and then start your next goal or journey or whatever it is.
Yeah. I I was thinking while you guys were talking was that if what Shaun was saying, if you set your sights on Everest, right, and you've never climbed a mountain before, you don't even know what climbing, what it actually takes, that's going to enter you into a world you know nothing about, which is good because now you have to learn it, right? If you've never climbed before, Kate, I mean, I'm sure we all know, what are the steps in order to start mountain climbing, right? You got to go to a gym, you got to figure out how to use the ropes, you got to learn knots, you got to learn, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, you could book a flight to Nepal and walk to base camp basically by yourself if you wanted to, but you're not going to go anywhere unless you have an actual understanding of climbing. And that's how it starts, right? I love the point that Shaun was saying, is that you put your sights way down the road, and then you start doing what's necessary. You start learning the skill set. You start learning the new style of things. And it reminds me, I had maybe a little epiphany yesterday. I was talking with my son, and I always say, now we got to get the work done. Okay, we figured it out. We have a plan. Now let's do the work. And Shaun always, ribs me a little bit on this one, is that it's not about the work, it's about the effort. It's the amount of effort you're putting in. And I think as long as your effort is consistent in the journey, right, then you will reach your goal eventually, or you may not. But the effort is the key point in that. And as to your point, Kate, is that climb top of the mountain, you have to have enough left in the tank to get back down. And that's part of the effort. That's part of the mental effort of going, okay, let's be smart about this. Let's plan this out step by step. Okay, that's going to get us here, and then it's going to bring me back, and I'll be safe and good to go. Do you guys have any?
I'd just like to throw one more thing in there. So just anyone who's listening to this, don't feel like you've got to become a nut master 9000 in order to start planning your trip to Nepal, because that's not true. There's many ways to skin a cat. And I think that you can focus on all the technical attributes before you tie on your first mountain boot in order to take your first step. But I don't think that's necessary. It's a way. There's another way, and it's called having an adventurous spirit. Mm-hmm. And so if you're not adventurous, start thinking about getting adventurous, because that's going to take you places. That's going to take you up the mountains. If you don't know what mountain you're supposed to climb, don't sweat it. Look for adventure. That'll take you up a mountain. And let me give you a real case example. My wife, Doreen, she has been at base camp of Everest. And, maybe that wasn't her life goal, but she's an adventurous person. And so, she found herself in Nepal with some friends. They trekked out. They got to the base of Everest. They climbed up Everest to the base camp where Nepalese climbers and other climbers were being treated for oxygen-related medical illnesses, high altitude based. And so she was a volunteer there for a week at base camp to help people who were struggling from high altitude. That's not her job. She's not a medical physician. It wasn't her life goal to go up there and help people at the base camp of Everest. But she's an adventurer, man. And so you don't have to know where you're going to climb. You don't have to know how high you're going to climb. You don't even have to have a goal in mind. But if you're an adventurer, you'll find some interesting things in life that will teach you a thing or two.
That's a great point. And thank you for the clarification, because you're 100% right. Any thoughts on any of this? Anybody got anything? Seb, yeah?
I love excuse me. I love what Shaun just said there. And it kind of brought me down to a conversation I had earlier with one of my good friends, Ibby from New West Alliance there. Shout out to Ibby. But Ibby and I were talking, and we were talking about a specific fighter by the name of Jeremy Kennedy, I watched on the mats for the first time when he was probably 7, maybe a little bit younger. And he was already putting in the work. I don't want to call him gifted, because I'm going to take away all the work that he put in, because he was on the mats every day. And so you can't call somebody that trains every day gifted. They just work for it, right? So I was watching him, and I remember watching him going, this guy's going places. In that same crew, there were a few other guys training for mixed martial arts that were way better, that had way more tools, that had more aggression, that were more able to impose their will on other humans, and they had seemingly a straight shot to the top shows in mixed martial arts. But there was one in the group that took every single opportunity to compete and fight. Every single one of them. It didn't matter if he didn't feel ready. It didn't matter if he didn't feel that his grappling was on point, that his stand-up was on point, or whatever the case was. One of those guys made it to UFC. Him. Nobody else. Because everybody was waiting for the perfect totality of their own circumstances. Everybody was waiting for their grappling to be at the level at which they felt they qualified. Everybody wanted to wait for their stand-up to be where it needed to be. And at the end of the day, the person that had, the stones of going, knowing full well that this wasn't the best laid out plan, and ended up succeeding where everybody else failed. And this is no knock on the others. They chose other careers and whatever, right? But when you look in terms of potential or what could have been, and the financial freedom that came along with that for Jeremy, those types of things, you can't make that stuff up. But he took every opportunity to expose himself and be adventurous in his pursuit.
Yeah, that makes perfect sense. Absolutely. We are just about our hour here. Does anybody have any final thoughts, perhaps, on the voices in your head, or who you look up to, or how many voices are speaking in your head?
If somebody
It
just
was all
joined,
going so well until then.
Right there.
somebody just joined, they're like, what?
Yeah, the voices in your head. I had to be very careful when I was writing the description earlier, where I was like, we're going to be in a conversation about the voices in your head. I was like, that doesn't sound about right. But anybody got any thoughts, any tips, any piece of advice for others who perhaps maybe have a lot of intrusive thoughts or negative self-talk, or anything that they could pass on to others that might be struggling with the voices in their head, or which voices are in their head, or when, or anything like that? Anybody? Bueller?
Well, I think what we established today for ourselves anyway, or I'll speak for myself, is that you can have competing voices in your head. They can compete. They can be both positive and negative fuel sources, as long as you understand how to manipulate them or to recruit them in order to have better outcomes. So whosever voice you hear, whether it's yours or someone else's, whether it's positive or negative, it's your job to figure out how to use that to better yourself. And so I've figured out a way. Maybe it's not the perfect way, but it's worked for me for a long time. And my way doesn't need to be your way, but you've got to find your way in order to do better.
Yeah, that's a great point. Kate, Seb, Glenn, anybody? No, everyone's tapping out. Like,
I'm gonna start charging Seb some rent for living in my head.
there you go. That's the way to do it.
I'm going to send my check this month as well.
Yeah.
Seb's going to be making money hand over fist pretty soon.
Not much, though.
All
The check
right.
won't be big.
Yeah, hopefully it doesn't bounce. That's the key.
I hope I can get it through volume there, Shaun. Even if I don't have a lot of money from each of you.
I was as we've been going through this conversation, and I was thinking there's that old I guess maybe it's an old moniker or old thought process where it's like, you have two wolves in your mind, and it's whichever one you feed. And I was thinking about it in another term. Once you started talking about fighter, Seb, I was thinking to myself that really it's whichever wolf or whichever fighter you're cornering, right? You're the one that determines who's going to win that fight with how you utilize those voices. And if you can utilize those you can use the negative self-talk and push yourself forward. Okay, that'll work in that time period. And if you need the positive voices to get you through a certain area, cool. You corner those voices, but always be aware that as some people put it, you're in control. It's your mind. It's your brain. It's your program, as Shaun likes to say, right? Run it the way you want it, and make sure that it gets you where you want to go. Any final thoughts before we shut her down from the peanut gallery? Everyone's shaking their head. No. Glenn,
I just want to say thanks for showing up, and you all know the deal now. I love this stuff, man. It's awesome.
Right.
Thanks for kicking ass.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Anybody else? Final thoughts? Seb, Glenn, Kate? No? All good? Okay, cool. We're going to shut her down before an hour. Whoa. Mind blowing.
I'm sure we won't. You're going to
We're
drag it
meeting
out.
I'm going to drag it out. I'm just going to keep talking and talking. I got 30 seconds left. I'm just going to keep going. Yeah, no, it's all good. We'll shut her. Oh, and there goes Glenn. He just took off. He's like, out. Okay, everybody. Thanks very much for joining us. If you haven't already, make sure that you subscribe and like and do the little notification bell thingy. And yeah, hang out with us while we learn, build, and grow here on The Collective. We'll see y'all tomorrow.
Chimo.